Genesis chapter 18 today, Genesis chapter 18. To review, I thought it would be fun, because I know review is fun for everybody, including myself. We're going to review ages, all right? I don't. Has anybody ever? Is there anybody in here that you're kind of like a? You don't have to be a daily journaler, but somebody that keeps kind of tabs on your life, like you'll write in a journal or maybe even a diary or something like that, some different highlights of your life. Is there anybody that does that here? Some of you do. That's what I feel like this morning is it's kind of like just touching on briefly age highlights of this man that we've been studying, not just this man, but also his wife, Sarah. So if you have something to scratch this down on, I think it'll be helpful, just in case you're like me. I forget things. It's very easy, as you get older to just start forgetting things. Even if you're young and you think you've got a great memory, I wish this week that you would walk from one room to another to get something, and then when you get there that you'd forget about what you were going into the room to get. So if you're younger, I hope that happens to you this week, okay? So here we go. Quick review, Abraham's happenings by age. So in Scripture, the first place that we meet Abram, and his name is changed to Abraham, but is at 75 years old. And that's when he received the three promises from God. And what are those three? I know we say this every week, super important. What are they? Land, nation, blessing. And it's important to remember that especially what we've been talking about, and especially what we'll be leading up to over the next couple weeks, concerns a lot nations, that if nations would come through Abraham and his wife Sarah, and also if there would be this blessing ultimately we discover is the person of Christ. So through the descendants of Abraham would eventually come this blessing to all peoples of the earth. And that blessing that would come to all peoples of the earth is that all people would have the opportunity for salvation through this one who would be a descendant of Abraham. So at 75 years old, he receives three promises: land, nation, blessing. Then a decade later, and I know that's a big skip, but that's one of the highlights. At 85 years old, God swore on himself that he would keep these promises. We saw that in Genesis chapter 15. The promises were made in Genesis 12, and then we see God swearing on himself, because after a decade, Abraham was kind of frustrated that none of this had taken place yet, that he hadn't seen these things come to fruition as God had promised him 10 years before. And then we see things starting to quicken a little bit, because at 86 years old, Abraham and his wife Sarai, they decided that we're going to help God along in this because we haven't seen any fulfillment of this promise. So 11 years into the promise that God had made, they decided that because Abraham and Sarah could not conceive, she could not have children, and in order to have from you to come nations, there would need to be children born. And so because she was barren, they decided, hey, we're going to make our own way. And at 86 years old, Abraham conceived a son named Ishmael, not with Sarah, but with Sarai's servant Hagar. But God was very clear in Genesis 16 that Ishmael would not be the son of promise. And then we fast forwarded in a huge way, and it was kind of something that we talked in depth about, but it was 13 years later when the story picks up again. In Genesis chapter 17, we find that God reaffirms his Genesis 12 covenant with Abraham. This would have been 24 years after the initial promise that Abraham received in Genesis 12. So 75 years old, he received the promise. And then we find at 99 years old that God reaffirms his promise. And in Genesis, I know you're in chapter 18, but in Genesis 17, verses 19 and 21, it says that Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. And then verse 21, but I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. So one of the reasons we paid close attention to time and age is to show that God matures a person's faith over time, not overnight. And I hope that is etched in your memory, because we do not live in that kind of a society. Yesterday, I ordered K-Cups, which I know is, for those of you who are coffee snobs, you're repulsed now, and you'll probably walk out. I ordered K-Cups last night, and you know when they arrived? When I got up at 5:30 this morning, they were there. We're used to getting things quickly. They just, and everything in life is quick. It's in a hurry. It's when can it happen? And it's unfathomable for us to consider that God does not work in that way. In fact, there are very few instances where we see God's plan unfolding over a very, very, very short period of time. Usually we see God's plan unfolding in a slow, methodical way as God is working through his people. And why does he work sometimes in a slow, methodical way? It's so he can mature us to sometimes be ready for whatever he's promised us. So we see this 24-year wait, and it helps us to understand that God was not the problem here, but he was chipping away at Abraham and Sarah and developing maturity in their faith. So you're in Genesis chapter 18 now. So when we turn from Genesis 17 to Genesis 18, it's likely just a couple months later. Genesis 17 focuses on the Lord's reaffirmation of the promises to Abraham. And then Genesis 18 that we're going to look at today focuses on Sarah's reaction to God's promise of a son. And the reason that we know that this is only a couple months later is that God had come to Abraham in Genesis 17 and said, next year you're going to have this child. And as far as we can tell, Sarah was not pregnant yet, but God promised that their son Isaac will be born within a year. And the scriptures are going to focus on God's ability to do what seems humanly impossible. Now, we love to talk about this. We love to hear stories about this, read books about this, see movies about this, somebody that has overcome seemingly impossible obstacles to accomplish something great. But I want to set a frame of mind here that it really is going to go counterculture to, not necessarily to our culture, but our church culture. It's important to note that God's accomplishment of impossible things doesn't necessarily arise from the heart of man, but the heart of God. Life is not about us determining what we want and then asking God for it, but us aligning ourselves with the heart of God to see him accomplish his will. Now, before we jump into Genesis 18, and by the way, we're not going to cover a lot of verses today, so it gives me a little room on the front end to talk about something that I feel like is at the top, one of the top problems theologically within the church realm, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. This is an international problem. And it really is born out of this cultural phenomenon that if you can dream it, you can do it. If you can imagine it or see it, it can be accomplished. And I mean, it sounds good, right? We want to, let people know that whatever your mind, whatever you set your mind to do, you're going to be able to do it. You can accomplish it. And what happens is oftentimes that we rip that philosophy from the world over into our faith. And God becomes like a genie. And we imagine that whatever we want to accomplish in our lives, that we just tell God that this is what we want to do, and then he's our genie or he's our butler, and he is going to do that on our behalf. Now, I know some of you along the way in the comments that I make next are going to bristle up to what I say, but I'm going to 100% stand behind what I say today. And here's what I want to make clear to us. some churches wrongly teach that if you can dream it or claim it in faith, that God will absolutely do it. One of the clearest examples that we see of this in the modern day church is through a teaching called the prosperity gospel. Now, this term prosperity gospel, I'm not sure where technically that term or who coined that term, but the prosperity gospel as a whole has infiltrated the American church. And unfortunately, in infiltrating the American church has taken this teaching to places all over the world, especially your countries that have struggled with poverty and sickness. Because this philosophy, or this teaching, this false teaching, is one that is most prominent in a movement of the prosperity gospel. And what are these prosperity gospel preachers and televangelists? What do they do? Well, in my opinion, and I think that this is clearly proved, is that they've deceived multitudes around the world with a false gospel. What does the prosperity gospel teach? Well, in a nutshell, they teach that individuals who exercise true faith in Christ will attain physical, material, and financial prosperity in this life. There are churches just right around the corner from us that teach this. Sometimes it's very clear in their teachings. Sometimes it's a little bit more disguised in their teachings. But allow me to, and I don't do this often, but sometimes the job of pastor is to warn. And I feel it's necessary to call out some names in the realm of the world today, the church world, that are propagating this philosophy. And I would even encourage you, if you have books by these people, or you listen to the sermons of these people, or you watch them on TV, or listen to them on the internet, or read their articles, I would encourage you to stop immediately. People like Kenneth Copeland or Benny Hinn. Now, maybe for so far, you're like, all right, no problem. This next one, I guarantee you, people in this room have some books of this person on your shelf. Joel Osteen, T.D. Jakes, John Hagee, Creflo Dollar, Paula White, and here's another one that might be offensive, Joyce Meyer. If you have material that you are learning from these individuals as your pastor, you don't have to do what I say, but I'm just encouraging you that this prosperity gospel being propagated is basically, if you name it or you claim it or you have enough faith. And that's such the easy out, right? If you pray about something in faith, if you pray that you want financial blessing or that you want to be healed of something and it doesn't happen, it's so easy for that leader or that pastor to come back on you and say, well, that's your fault, not God's, because you didn't have enough faith. And so there are no checks and balances in this whatsoever. And I think I was telling Jeff just briefly, but I wish we could dig a little bit further into this, because I truly believe that a lot of this teaching arises from the promises or the blessings that come with the Abrahamic covenant. There are promises that God makes to Abraham and his descendants, his nation, his people. And yes, there are promises of land and prosperity and that God would take away sickness. But here's where we need to be discerning individuals. these promises were not made to us. These promises were made to a specific nation. And so when you watch or read or listen to, and this is a short list, but when you listen to these individuals, they set up this gospel that in true faith, if you have genuine faith or strong enough faith, then God will do whatever you, and they don't say it like this, but this is what they're saying. God will do whatever you ask him to do. And I in my reading of Scripture, I really don't see that. I would look to the Apostle Paul, and I would say, out of all the people in the New Testament, he's a pretty good example of what it looks like to live a life of faith. And if you remember, Paul had some kind of a thorn in his side, and the Scriptures never tell us what it is. So we're just left to the imagination. Was it a health problem? Some people say he had bad eyesight. Some people say it was an individual or a group of people. But he begged God to take that away. And God didn't do that. So do we say, well, the Apostle Paul, he just didn't have enough faith, and therefore God didn't answer his prayer? And what I want to help us to guard against as we're walking through this is to understand that these televangelists who have commercialized this teaching of the prosperity gospel in our day are doing more harm than good, because they are making God out to be our servant and not we his. Now, you're in Genesis 18. Hold your place there for just a second, and I want you to go to the Old Testament to Psalm 37. And I want to look at verse 4. And growing up, I love this verse. I still love this verse. I think it's relevant to our day and shows the character of God, but there's a proper order to this. Psalm 37:4 says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." Okay, so think through that. Delight yourself. We love, like, the second part of this. It's one of those things you go, right, we're putting this on the wall in our kitchen, or when people come in the door of our house, we're gonna have this so it's displayed, that God will give you the desires of your heart. But if we're not careful, we don't understand that this is conditional. There's something that comes before him giving us the desires of our heart, and that is delighting yourself in the Lord. So when we make Jesus our greatest delight, we will find that there is no joy greater than the joy that he gives. We will find that all the worldly things we once envied no longer appeal to us. As we pursue joy in Jesus, he will increasingly become our greatest longing. Let me say it in a more simplistic way. When I take pleasure in the Lord, when I delight in him first, my desires are matched with his desires. This is not about me telling God, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do, and then God, you will do this. You see, that's flipped around. And what we need to understand is that our heart is matched with God's desires. And so when I'm delighting in the Lord, when he's first place, when my heart is his, when I'm reading the scriptures and I'm captivated by what he has said, when I'm delighting in those words, then the desires that he has are matched with my desires. So what he desires, I love, because those are his words. And we need to make sure, as we look into these promises that God gave Abram, remember, when we look back to the beginning, was it Abraham that was like, hey, God, I got an idea for you. I want you to give me land. I want you to give me nations, and I want you to give me a blessing. Did that promise arise from Abraham telling God what to do? No. And I think that we find this over and over when we look at, we're considering next year going into the book of Exodus. You guys might remember Moses. Was Moses like, oh yeah, I would love to be the guy that delivers the people, your people, God, from Egypt. They've been in bondage for hundreds of years, and I'm your guy. Was he raising his hand for the job? No, because when God came to him, he was like, find somebody else. I can't speak well. And look at David. You guys that are in the Bible study, you men and women that are in the Bible study right now, where did that arise from? Was David like, ooh, pick me to be the king? No, he didn't even show up at the first place that they were picking out who would be the next king. He was still in the fields. We can look at Joseph, that hopefully we're going to be looking at in the fall this year. But Joseph, yes, God gave Joseph dreams, but God is the one that initiates these things. And so it's important for us to understand that it's God who gets to call the shots. It is not you and I that treats God as our butler or our genie, that we tell him what to do in faith and then he does it. It's the wrong way. It's we match our heart with God's desires, and when I love God first, when I placed him first, then the desires that he has through the scriptures are going to become my desires. So our hearts are matched. And I think this is an important conversation for us to have. It's one that, again, part of the job of myself and Jeff and Nolan and all of our pastors and leaders is sometimes we are protective of the people that we're ministering to. And we feel like it's important. And what you need to really discern is like, these people that you're listening to, these people that you're allowing to, and listen, I listen to a lot of other pastors. There's some great pastors in our, not just in the United States, but all over the world. But I would dare say that some of the ones that rise to the top, not all of them, but some of the ones that rise to the top have this very, very discreet prosperity gospel teaching in it. Even some of the individuals that we would say have some of the largest churches in America. And so I want to caution you to that, because what we're going to look at today is helping us to fully understand that it's God. These things begin with God, and then we kind of fall in line with God's promises, okay? Just the beginning. What we're covering today is not going to take us a long time, but I feel like this is a great place because of what we're discussing for a few moments today, jump into Genesis chapter 18. So you're in Genesis 18. We're going to look at Abraham's encounter with the Lord. So the first thing we're going to see is that the Lord and two angels appear to Abraham. Look in verse 1. It says, and the Lord appeared. Let's just remember this, okay, just as a reminder. You guys remember who's writing the book of Genesis? Moses, okay, very good. He wrote first 5 books. So Moses is recounting for Israel the beginnings, where they came from, their history. So the Lord, he's saying, the Lord appeared to him, speaking of Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent. It's interesting that Abraham is still living in a tent in the heat of the day, so it's hot. Verse 2. Abraham, lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. So immediately, Abraham recognizes or regards these visitors as worthy of great respect. And I think in general, like if you look at the culture, lots of people were traveling in this time. They were Bedouin, or they were people that went from one place to the next. So there was a great emphasis on hospitality. So this would not have been abnormal at all. However, I think that I know that Abraham recognized them as distinct. And so look what he says in verse 3. He says, "O Lord." So immediately what we see here is that he recognizes one of these three individuals being the Lord. "I have found favor in your sight. Do not pass by your servant." So though the Lord, in the person of Christ, appeared to Abraham twice before. Remember this? Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, chapter 17, verse 1. And we're honestly not sure if, it's hard. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. It's a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Did he recognize him because, he had already seen Jesus face to face? I don't know. Or maybe Abraham just simply knew who it was by some sort of intuition or some type of spiritual knowledge. Not sure. But in verse 4, we see what he did. He says, "Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree." Remember, they've been traveling, so as a matter of hospitality, he's like, let's do everything that we can. Let's get you cleaned up. Let's get you some rest. In verse 5, he says, "While I bring a morsel of bread." This is interesting. This is a side light. So he says, when I bring a morsel of bread, so just chuck that in the back of your mind. A morsel of bread to me is like, okay, here's a little piece of bread. Okay, we're going to see what he does in a second here. "That you may refresh yourselves. And after that, you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." Verse 6. "And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, 'Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour.'" Now, I don't know if anybody says, "Alexa, what's a seah?" But a seah is probably equal to about 42-ish pounds of fine flour. A lot. They must have been hungry. And the other thing is, Abraham probably wasn't a great cook, so he's like, "Sarah, you gotta get this stuff." And he says, "Knead it and make cakes." Verse 7. "And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly." Again, the hospitality here. Again, he recognizes the Lord, and he just was being hospitable in that nature. So he went and he told this young man, find something good for our guests. Verse 8. "Then he took curds." Again, just trying to help us along here. Curds. I describe it as like, anybody ever heard of TCBY, Country's Best Yogurt? It's probably something similar to yogurt, and I'm imagining it was just fantastic. But so what it was, something probably yogurt-like, and milk, and the calf that he had prepared, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. So it's interesting. He says, "Here's a morsel of bread. Stay around. A morsel of bread," and then it becomes this entire spread, right? All this stuff. Abraham is being incredibly hospitable. Now, can I ask you to remember something? So over the next couple weeks, as we move into next week's message, and then the messages on Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's daughters and some crazy stuff that happened there, I want you to just remember the hospitality that Abraham shows to the Lord and these 2 angels. And then we're going to see a movement of these angels further, and they're going to go to Lot. And they're going to be received in a much different way when they go and visit Lot. So please just keep this in the back of your mind. It's one of those things that I honestly, at 50 years old, I never noticed the comparison that was being made here. So we have the hospitality of Abraham, and then as the angels move on, you'll see the quote unquote hospitality that they receive in Sodom and Gomorrah. So Abraham's visitors were meant to convey intimate fellowship, to eat together, even though Abraham was simply just there as they ate. But it was important for fellowship, peace offerings, and treaties. And when the Lord was ready to specify the fulfillment of the covenantal promise, he came in person and ate in Abraham's tent. Nothing could more significantly communicate their close relationship. Again, how many years after the initial promise? 24 years. So here's how this part of the story concludes. Look at verse 9. They said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she's in the tent. Verse 10. It's kind of, just keep that in the back of your mind, that question there. Where's Sarah? Verse 10, the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now, I love to eavesdrop. I'm going to be the first to admit. Like, I don't know. There's just something about, let me give you two examples. Number one, I'm not quite at that age yet. First of all, I'm not retired. But when we moved into our neighborhood back in 1999, everybody on our street was retired. It was the best thing in the entire world because they just watched everything. But if a police car ever stops at somebody's house, I'm like, all right, everybody turn off the lights. We're like peeking out the window. Does anybody else do that, or is it just me? Okay, thank you. The rest of you are lying because I know you're curious. Stop over at your neighbor's house like, yeah, I noticed there was a cop car at your house last night. Everything okay? But I told you I would tell you some stories along the way about my travels. And I had the craziest airplane experiences that I've ever had in traveling for 25 years. I don't sleep well, as I told you, on airplanes at all. So this flight was only 6 hours from Philadelphia to Dublin. And it must have, I don't know what time it was, but I fell asleep. And, you're kind of like, for me, it's like I'm in this twilight sleep. And I kept, my arm kept slipping off. So I would have it here and I was sleeping. It would slip off because I was on the aisle seat. And I woke up. And when I woke up, there was literally a guy he was like laying on the floor. And I was kind of like, what's happening here? And so I was like looking around, and nobody. A couple of people was awake, and they were just staring at the guy, and I was like, what did I miss here? So then he starts rolling from side to side. So my immediate thought is, oh my word, he's having a seizure. So I start unbuckling my seatbelt. If you heard my first story, I did learn the second time how to unbuckle that seatbelt to get up to help him. So I'm like going to unbuckle my seatbelt, and as I'm unbuckle my seatbelt to get out of the seat, the flight attendant comes over. And this guy, had gotten himself up, and then he fell again, and he was leaning into the wall. So immediately I was like, okay, we're heading to Ireland. Maybe he likes Guinness a lot. It's like, I don't know. So he was like, so I just got into this eavesdropping thing. I was pretending I was asleep. I had one eye open because I wanted to see what was going on. So I heard him say to the flight attendant, I need to get into the bathroom. So he goes to get into the bathroom, and initially he can't figure out how, do I push it in? Do I pull it out? How do I get it? So he finally figures out that he has to push it in. He pushes it in, literally falls into the bathroom. Literally falls into the bathroom. So now I'm fully awake. I'm like, what's happening here? So the flight attendant was amazing, and he was just, helped the guy, kept bringing him water. I couldn't quite, this sounds weird to say, but I couldn't see into the bathroom, but I was certainly trying to partner what was happening. And at that moment, I was like, you know what? You become your parents. You like to eavesdrop. You like to see what's happening with everybody. And I imagine that Sarah was the same way. She was in the tent and she was eavesdropping. She wanted to know, what are these guys doing here? What are they saying? What does this mean for Abraham? What does this mean to me? So I can just imagine her maybe kind of just peeking out the tent or having her ear up to the tent, probably some type of a cloth that separated where they were. She was just listening in to what was being said. And it says in verse 10, the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. And then there's a note. Remember, this is Moses writing here. He's recounting this for Israel as a note. Moses writes in here under the inspiration of the Spirit, just in case we had forgotten. And now Abraham and Sarah were old. Now, again, we don't say that. You should have used the word seasoned there. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years, and notice what he says that helps us to understand the impossibility of this situation. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So let's just call it what it is here, folks. He knows menopause. Thank you. Thank you. Right? We can move on to the next point now. Thank you. In other words, she wasn't having any children. She was just not in that place anymore. So go to verse 12. And here's, as Sarah is eavesdropping, and she hears this, here's her reaction. So Sarah laughed, and then what are the next two words? To herself. She didn't laugh out loud. It wasn't an LOL. But to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, in other words, Abraham's an old dude, shall I have pleasure? Now, again, I'm not trying to be crass. I'm not trying to be weird, but let's just bring this into reality. Was there a point where they just stopped trying to have a child? Was there just some point where it was like, hey, this isn't going to happen, so, we're not going to have sexual relations anymore? But God had promised that this would come true, that this promise that he had made. And she laughed to herself. And in case we're kind of hard on Sarah here, remember last week in Genesis chapter 17, verse 17, when Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Let's not be hard on Sarah here and say, listen, man, she just didn't. Abraham had just done the same thing to himself, thinking that God was clueless as to how they really felt in their hearts. And this is what I need us to see. Verse 13. The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? And then he asks a question. Verse 14. This is what, is anything too hard for the Lord? What a question. What a question to set Abraham and Sarah in the place that says, what God promises, he will always do. The words God says, he will always keep. And what he was helping them to understand, because this question is not answered for us as the reader. I think it's called like a rhetorical question. Didn't really need an answer. It's an understood question or answer. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Now, for those of us that have grown up in Sunday school, we know the right answer. The right answer is there is nothing too hard for God to do. I don't know if you've asked yourself that question lately. But it's a difficult question. Because maybe some of you look at your life right now, and again, I want, in just a second, we're going to close this out, but I want us to look at this from the perspective of God. But there is nothing in your life that is too difficult for God to handle. Again, let me attach that to the fact that God never promised to take away any obstacle or circumstance that's difficult. He never promised that. But if we would answer the question, knowing God's character, is there anything too hard for the Lord? There is not one thing that God cannot do. He is all-powerful. And whatever he, even from the beginning in speaking creation into existence, he simply speaks and it can be done. So what happened? Well, it says, at the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. Verse 15, but Sarah denied it. She denied that she had laughed, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. So how do we handle the seemingly impossible circumstances of life? Can I just give this to you in closing? When you have a situation that humanly is impossible, it is an opportunity for you to exercise faith, not in a circumstance or scenario that you've created. But I need us to see this in a threefold way. How do we handle the seemingly impossible circumstances of life? How will God step in and do the impossible? Number one, sometimes the circumstance will change. Times that you will pray based in the promises of God or the words of God, and what you pray will happen. You could pray for healing in your own body or somebody else, and God could step in and change that circumstance. But secondly, how does God handle the seemingly impossible circumstances of life? Sometimes we will change. It goes back to what I said at the very beginning. God will match our desires with his. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. It's possible for you that God will never change your circumstance, but he will change you. He will change the way that you think about the circumstance or that seemingly impossible thing in your life. Or third, how do we handle the seemingly impossible circumstances of life? God sustains us and remains good when nothing changes. That's the hardest one, isn't it? But is anything too hard for the Lord? No. Sometimes he steps in and he changes the circumstances. Sometimes he changes us. But other times, he does the impossible by sustaining us and remaining good even though nothing else changes. And where is that rooted? It's rooted in the character of God. And today, I don't, in the deepest parts of every person's heart here, like I don't know. When you look at your life and you say, this is, to me, this just seems impossible. Maybe for you it's a marriage gone wrong, or some type of a transition, something happened to you out of the blue, you weren't expecting it and it happened. Maybe it's just physical health or mental health or something with trying to raise your kids. Or this, we could talk about so many scenarios here. And you look at it and you think to yourself, maybe you get up every day or you go to sleep every night and that situation is just on your mind. It is just there. It's present all the time. And I think what we have to ask ourselves, and maybe this would be helpful, maybe this is a practical application. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is there any circumstance or situation in your life right now that God cannot take care of? And the answer to that is no. There is not one thing that he cannot do. How will he do it? Again, let me just close with this. Sometimes the circumstance will change. That means that God does the impossible. Sometimes God will just change you, the way that you think about the circumstance. And other times, even though nothing changes, God sustains you and remains good through the circumstance. Let's pray.